Next, today I want to talk a bit about the analysis of central bank interest rates amidst potential US trade policies. Now, I've spoken about this previously, right? At the beginning of the this year, where I introduced, overall looking at the direction of the market. And the reason why I'm bringing it up again, because of Trump's ascension to the presidency of the United States, right? And because less than a month into his presidency, Donald Trump has actively pursued his campaign promises, particularly regarding tariffs. Now, his administration initially imposed tariffs on Colombia, followed by Mexico, Canada, and China. Now, while tariffs on most nations have been delayed, China remains subject to a 10% tariff. And in response, China has retaliated with tariffs of 15% on energy exports and 10% on 72 manufactured products. And that's the reason why I want to discuss this and bring this up all again, because now the fundamental has changed. There are retaliations, and we want to see how does all this news affect the currencies, right? So we have seen so far there are some changes in the expectations of how Trump has been been handling all these tariffs. Now, Trump reversed his decision to eliminate the de minimis loophole, which previously allowed small value imports under 800 US dollars from China to bypass tariffs, right? However, his administration has signaled that this exemption will be removed once the US Commerce Secretary establishes a new collection system. Now, today, Trump is expected to announce 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the US, which would come on top of existing metal duties. Now, this development increased the likelihood of a trade war, prompting concerns over how central banks will adjust monetary policy to navigate the economic uncertainty. So let us now look into the major currencies one by one. Now, the first obviously would be the United States dollar, held by the Federal Reserve. Now, the Fed is expected to cut rates by 50 basis points, no changes so far since my January report, bringing the final rate to 4% in 2025. However, this reduction is modest compared to other major economies, signaling that Fed remains cautious about inflation, especially with a strong labor market. As such, the US dollar may retain its strength as US Treasury yields will still be active relative to economies implementing deeper rate cuts. So if global uncertainty rises due to trade conflicts, the dollar safe haven status could further support its strength. Okay. Next is the euro. The ECB, or European Central Bank, is expected to cut rates by 100 basis points, bringing the final rate to 2.15% in 2025. So with inflation relatively under control at 2.4%, the ECB is shifting to a more accommodative stance to boost growth. However, wider rate differentials between the Fed and the ECB will likely weaken the euro, encouraging capital outflows. Now, the euro's depreciation could also be exacerbated if Trump expands tariffs to the EU, adding additional economic strain. Yeah. Next is the British pound. Now, BOE is expected to cut rates by 75 basis points, bringing the final rate to 4% by the end of 2025. Governor Bailey has acknowledged that the UK economy is weakening with slower jobs markets growth. So with this, the pound faces downward pressure, particularly against the US dollars, which maintains higher rates. Now, post-Brexit uncertainties and potential US trade actions could further weaken the pound if tariffs on UK goods are implemented. Okay, so you have to take note on this. Another thing is that in January, I mentioned that the Bank of England, I expected 100 basis points. That has changed. With the latest round of cut, they have done one cut already so far this year. And after the cut, the governor said, Governor Bailey said that probably another 2 more cuts, and inflation should reach their targeted level already. Okay, so this is one change that we have seen so far for the pound. Okay, nevertheless, expected cuts total will be 75 basis points. Now, for the Japanese yen, unlike other major central banks, the Bank of Japan is set to increase rates by 75 basis points to 1% by 2025. This signals a shift away from Japan's long-standing negative interest rate policies. The yen may appreciate particularly against the euro and pound as these economies are aggressively cutting rates. Now, if you have been following religiously the report since January, I mentioned that one of the ways is to sell the euro yen as well as the pound yen. Big movement since then, since the report was out, and you've taken that opportunity. The euro yen alone, I think you would have made about 800 over pips already from the drop from the day the report was released to today, until the low. Now, however, if Japan exports are hit by new US tariffs, BOJ's tightening may be less aggressive than projected. Yeah, okay. For the Swiss franc, the Swiss National Bank is expected to cut rates by 50 basis points, bringing its policy rate down to 0% in 2025. So while easing could weaken the franc, Switzerland's safe haven status may prevent excessive depreciation. So if the US-China tensions escalate, the Swiss could attract investors, limiting losses against the dollar. Okay, the Swiss franc. As for the Australian dollar, the RBA is expected to cut rates by 100 basis points, bringing the final rate to 3.35% by 2025. Rate cuts coupled with China tariffs on energy exports could negatively impact the Australian economy, weakening the Aussie dollar further. So as Australia depends on commodity exports, any downturn in global demand will exert additional downwards pressure on the currency. Yeah. Next is the New Zealand dollar. The RBNZ is expected to cut rates by 75 basis points, with the cash rate finishing at 3.5% in 2025. So while this weakens the New Zealand dollar, its relatively high yield compared to other markets may still attract investors. However, should trade tensions escalate further, New Zealand's reliance on exports like China could intensify risk. Okay, and finally, the Canadian dollar, the Bank of Canada is expected to cut rates by 75 basis points, bringing the final rate to 2.5% by the end of 2025. So with potential US tariffs on Canadian exports, including automobiles and energy products, the loonie may weaken further. Canadian economy's vulnerability to US policy decisions could exacerbate volatility in Canadian exchange rates. Okay. So as a conclusion, the global monetary landscape in 2025 is shifting towards easing, with most central banks cutting rates, except for Japan, which is raising rates. The US Federal Reserve remains relatively hawkish, keeping the dollar strong, while the ECB, the BOE, and the RBA adopt more aggressive rate cuts, weakening their respective currencies. So if Trump's trade war escalates, currencies with higher dependence on exports, like the what they call commodity currencies, like the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, and the Chinese yuan, could face significant depreciation. Meanwhile, safe haven currencies like the US dollar, the Swiss franc, and possibly the Japanese yen may retain strength, particularly if risk sentiment deteriorates. Now, given the potential economic headwind from protectionist policies, central banks may be forced to adjust their rate trajectories further. The magnitude of global rate cuts could deepen if trade restrictions disrupt supply chains, weaken corporate earnings, and slow global growth. However, if Trump's tariffs are minimal and primarily used as bargaining tool to negotiate better trade deals, the US dollar could weaken instead. A de-escalation in trade tensions would reduce inflationary pressures, allowing the Federal Reserve to cut rates more aggressively than currently projected. This would diminish the yield advantage of the US dollar, leading to potential capital outflows in other currencies and commodities, right? So we have seen so far the US actually using, no, Trump actually using it. For example, give you an example, like Colombia was the first nation to be hit by the tariffs. And Trump said that if you don't accept, you don't pay for the deportation, and you don't, for the Colombians, the illegal Colombians in the US that we are sending back to you, I will impose tariffs on your country. And straight away, Colombia yielded. Okay, the same thing for Mexico and Canada. Trump actually managed to get Claudia Sheinbaum, which is the president of Mexico, to actually send 10,000 troops to the borders of the US to ensure that there are no illegal immigrants as well as drugs going into the US. The same thing for Canada as well. Okay, so based on this, Trump announced that there will be a 1 month delay in tariffs towards the Colombia, Mexico, and as well as Canada, while they discuss better trade deals among themselves. Okay, so we can see clearly that it is used as a bargaining tool. So if Trump plays this card with every single nation, including the European nation and as well as the Asian region, this escalation in trade tensions could happen. And in such situations, yes, the US dollar would weaken instead. So in essence, monetary policy alone may not be sufficient to counteract the economic impact of trade tensions, making fiscal policy and geopolitical negotiations critical factors in shaping the financial landscape in 2025. So the trajectory of the US dollars and global interest rates will ultimately hinge on how aggressive Trump's tariff policies become and how central banks respond to the evolving economic environment. Okay. So with that, that's a report for today.